The hand-turned binding is the traditional way. If you were submitting a quilt to a quilt show, you were doing it that way. But if you're making a big quilt that's going to be a serviceable quilt, a kid's quilt, maybe a king size, maybe it's going to go into the laundry a lot, there is a way to do this with turning it but hand sewing it. And this is a technique that I would like you to master for when you really are doing utility pieces. You make the binding exactly the way I did, okay, like this or like this, enough to go all the way around the quilt. But what you now do is you're going to take some plain old junky acrylic yarn. Nothing good. Nothing good. This has to be very, very soft yarn. Take the binding that you have just made, and you're going to lay this yarn right in the fold that the pressing made. You pressed your binding in half, but now we're laying a piece of yarn in, and then I'm going to couch this down with a zigzag stitch so that it looks like this. There's a zigzag stitch that is holding this yarn right in the fold that I created when I pressed my binding in half. Be sure that the bobbin thread matches your binding, because then you don't see it on the back. Here's an example, another one, where the binding has been couched in with a zigzag stitch. Yellow bobbin thread, you're not going to see it. Here's an example of, if I do not pay attention, then it will show. And here's an example of not paying attention to the bobbin thread, and you can see it. If that bobbin thread had been green, you would never know that it was there. So now I have laid a piece of yarn in that binding, and now I go to the machine and I put it on exactly the way I did the other binding, just traditional binding. Do the corners the same way. You might have to cut a little bit of the yarn out of the corner if it's too thick, but it all works. So you go all the way around the quilt, all the way around, the way you would do normal binding. But now, here's the difference. Here's my binding. It's sewed to the front, and now I'm going to turn it to the back, just the way I did with traditional binding, but instead of hand sewing it all the way around, and if it's a king-size quilt, that's a killer of a job, I am going to now go to the machine, and because I laid the yarn in here, when I go to the machine, my thumbnail feels the yarn. I can actually feel it right here. So come to the machine. And now, because I can feel that yarn, I can stitch in the ditch, and my stitching will be between the binding and the cording. My fingernail feels that cording, and I am in the ditch stitching by machine all the way around. You can do a king-size quilt in half an evening like that. If you match your thread to the top of your quilt, you won't even see it. Again, here's my fingernail. I know that I'm catching the back of my binding. And if I take it out and turn it, you can see that I have caught it by machine all the way around. It takes hours and hours and hours away from the labor you put into this, and it's a really good technique to know. That's it.